Hello and welcome to the People, Place and Nature podcast. One group seemingly always in the spotlight at the moment are our farmers, who are juggling the challenges of food production, economics and of course environmental considerations. But technology may be able to help them tackle these issues more effectively and help make funds more available for them to do so, which is one of the really big challenges. So that's what we're going to be talking about today with Tim Hopkins. I hope you enjoy this episode. Thank you for joining us, Tim.
Pleasure.
Wonderful to have you here today. Today's going to be a really interesting conversation about land management because you're involved so heavily in this area. And we met, I think it was at WWF, at an event with WWF.
It was.
And we sort of had a chat and we realised we were based in the same, or working in the same area. And it started a string of pub-related rants and conversations, didn't it, about what's going on, how we need to collaborate more, and that led on to more and more things, and we've kind of kept in touch ever since. So we've had quite an interesting relationship since then on the different aspects we're involved with. Yep. So it'd be really interesting to hear about what you're up to. So I was thinking maybe we could start with the Land app, perhaps?
Yeah, definitely. So where to start? So I was always very conscious as I was growing up that land management was kind of on a downward trajectory. Mm-hmm. I saw firsthand, being brought up on a farm, how difficult it was to make well-informed decisions, you know, whether it was on specific elements of the environment or the farming operations or how we engage the public. And as I was kind of growing up and thinking through some of those problems, it became really apparent that there was something that needed to be done. Mm-hmm. And I was fortunate enough to travel around the world, and I'm sure we'll pick up on that later, but I started to realise that the problems that I was facing at home were not unique to a farm in Surrey. Mm-hmm. They were something that really actually was causing massive issues in different parts of the world. And I realised that the only way to create a mass scale positive impact in how land is managed is through technology. Mm-hmm. So I was not in the technology world, and so it was a bit of a leap of faith to decide that this would be the direction to take. But essentially what the thesis was and is that if we can provide land managers with the information about their holding, what they've got, the landscape they sit in, the opportunities that are available to them, and then essentially support them through local advisors to design well-informed plans that align to the landscape, mm-hmm. that potentially and ideally are funded by either corporates or government, we can have this mass transition to best practice in land management. And that was always kind of the thesis that drove us in the early days and still drives us today, is that with all the ecological damage that's happening around the world, biodiversity loss, the climate change, the damage to rivers and ecosystems, I personally believe it can be very quickly turned around, mm-hmm. if only everyone that manages that pocket of land can make well-informed decisions. We know nature recovers so quickly. You know, if the right management techniques are put in place, soil sequesters carbon very quickly. But you fundamentally need land managers en masse to collaborate and implement great strategies, mm-hmm. that are going to lead to those outcomes. And that's essentially what the Land app is a easy to use digital mapping platform for land managers, their advisors, to work together to build these plans and submit those to funders. So yeah, that's essentially kind of what drives us and what mm-hmm. the platform essentially operates, the idea that it operates on, and essentially what we're doing with today.
That's it, and it's incredibly interesting because we've looked at it several times together, and been involved in various discussions, and there's so many issues around sort of streamlining, aren't they? Yep. There's been loads and loads of problems which makes farmers' lives very hard. They kind of lose interest in trying to create these design solutions because there's so much bureaucracy. Yep. It's so complicated, and they go one place for plans and reports, and then they come back from somewhere else and they're slightly different, and they have to go off again. And this kind of streamlines all of that, so it makes things easier, more accessible, and also better informed, as you say.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, land is such an interesting kind of asset if you want to put it into that class. You can only really use land in one way. It can either be a building or a woodland block or a field of maize or whatever. You know, you do have finite uses for land. And really the challenge is working out how to use land in the most effective way, mm-hmm. at a holding level, so that you can derive enough revenue that supports the business. But ideally what you want is that land design to be connected to the landscape. So you know, how do you kind of create riverbank restoration, but not just on your tiny, 100 meters of riverbank, but you're aligned to a project that connects potentially kilometers. So land is really interesting and unique because there's such an opportunity cost on land being used badly. There are so many negative externalities as a result of bad land management practice, and it sort of needs a mass transition. Little oases are not good enough for nature. We need this kind of mass movement towards this best practice. So yeah, all of those things you said is exactly what we're trying to enable, is just to help people understand what they can do on their finite patch that allows them to have the maximum possible benefit, both for themselves as a business, but also the wider landscape.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, the wider landscape side is obviously of real interest to me, being a landscape architect. And I know people like Merrick Denton Thompson, who we also had on the podcast, have been involved in all these things too, in these wider discussions. And how it integrates with the landscape is potentially going to be really interesting, because whilst I appreciate not everything's quite there yet and it's all being developed, which is something we can talk about, is that we're kind of looking at landscape character areas and how that can potentially form the basis of this regeneration. So, and landscape character areas are different to catchment areas, which a lot of people immediately think of when they think of kind of landscape scale, because they take into account sort of geology, ecology, and those more scientific bases, and obviously they also form part of a catchment. So it responds more to the unique situation of those areas than perhaps a catchment approach would do, which is just the basin which catches water.
Yeah, and that's a really powerful foundation to start from. You know, what does the local landscape essentially want to deliver, in a sense, if you could leave it to its own devices? What's interesting, but also the challenge in there is, and this is kind of something we're working on right now, is there's nature recovery networks which are being developed at the moment, which are trying to essentially align the landscape characters to the market needs and requirements, and try and create a framework for investment into nature that takes into consideration all of that. The reason that that's important is we know that corporates need to be investing back into nature, and also, of course, government wants to be investing into nature and the environment. And the question at the moment is, where do they invest their money to have the maximum possible benefits? So we want to take into consideration these landscape the landscape character areas, the nature recovery networks, the local priorities. We want the water companies to contribute and say, well, this is where we're having massive runoff because of X, Y, Z. We need to implement a solution here. We need to fund farmers to do certain things. So the challenge really is to take into consideration all of those needs and requirements from the landscape, and essentially make it really simple and digestible for farmers to know, okay, cool, I happen to sit here within the landscape, and right here I'm going to get funded to do this, right here I'm going to get funded to do here, this, and that's the challenge of the whole sector, is how do we simplify that decision making and make sure the funding can have the most positive benefit, so we get the biggest return on investment for the capital invested into nature.
Exactly, but you get this really interesting challenge, because obviously not all farmers are necessarily going to want to do what we want them to do, which is part of the challenge. But that's why things like public money for public good are going to be really important, and the changes to the Common Agricultural Policy and all this type of thing, and how that is going to filter down. And this is what our original kind of conversations were all about, was there has to kind of be a design solution potentially, which can take into account a range of different variables and design solutions to try and deliver what a range of farmers may want to do. And that's really going to be one of many challenges, possibly one of the later challenges, I suppose, because even after the funding and things are sorted out, people don't want to do it. It's a whole nother issue. Yeah,
and it's, although so many of these conversations end up coming back to money, and I guess maybe environmentalists and whatnot, and maybe even slightly myself, have always kind of wanted to say, well, it's just the best thing to do for nature. You know, we can reduce costs downstream, and, you know, land managers should just do this. But the truth is, they all run as businesses, right? They need to pay their salaries, they need to send their kids to school, they need to keep the lights on. So the biggest challenge, and this is where obviously the concept of natural capital comes in, is, you know, how do we value nature such that actually the payment that the land manager receives fairly remunerates them for what they're doing? Because unless we get that economic system in place, no one's going to do anything.
Exactly, yeah.
And there comes the challenge, because behaviour will always mould to incentives, and in a capitalist society like we're in at the moment, and everyone's got free choice, they can freely choose what they do or don't do, and fundamentally, to some degree, maybe not entirely, but that will predominantly come down to a financial decision. You know, what would my yield of this crop be? How much would I make? Would I get more if it was put into trees? And it's not to say that everyone is kind of mercenary and just wants the money, but it's such an important factor in how we evolve the way that nature ends up looking and the outcomes that get delivered. So it's this really knotty problem of kind of in the point that I just made about landscape priorities and funding opportunities is we need a land manager to very, very simply be able to say, oh, if I put woodland here, what would that deliver to me? Who's going to benefit?
That's going to shelter my animals, which are going to be more productive and less fatalities and all of this type of thing.
Exactly, and that is really difficult to do in an ad hoc way. So it requires science, it requires data, it requires knowledge and know-how, and that's really what we're trying to do in the Land app is configure the structure of the software so that those financial decisions or those business decisions can be made really easily by a farmer, but also just to make it super simple for the water company to notify the farmer of that funding opportunity, the local developer who's just taken down X amount of trees to notify the farmer of the energy. So that's what we're trying to do.
Yeah, exactly. Kind of just more a centralised system, basically. So it's a one-stop shop where they can find everything, and it makes everyone's lives hopefully much easier.
Yeah.
And the thing is as well, it's also important to kind of be aware that it's not necessarily, we talk about a lot about regenerative agriculture, and it doesn't necessarily mean planting trees everywhere or rewilding everything.
Correct.
A lot of it is taking existing processes and making them more effective.
Correct.
And more efficient.
Yep.
And a lot of that can be, as we talked about, tree planting. It often comes down to trees. A lot of arable systems could see more trees planted within field systems, which is going to protect them against drought and soil erosion and reduce pollution, which for the runoff for the water companies. And that means farmers will still be able to produce that crop, but hopefully that crop will be more resilient in the years to come. And we're seeing more and more sort of crop failures, generally, and species starting to struggle and reach the sort of limits of their ability. So a lot of it is about those sort of things, and there will be some instances where we can look at certain options, like we had Ted Green on talking about, and Jill Butler talking about a bit about the NEP estate and rewilding and all this type of thing, and they talk about wood pasture and how wood pasture is fantastic, but it's only, in my opinion, it's only really applicable to more pastoral systems. Whereas there also needs to be a solution to more arable systems as well, because after all, at the end of the day, we still have to produce food. And globally, there's going to be a bigger and bigger food crisis. So we've got to think about how to make our food supply more resilient.
No, it's absolutely. And I was actually with Ivan de Clay yesterday evening. We had a barbecue. We had NEP estate burgers, which were wonderful. And and that's a really interesting model. But of course, it can't be used in the east of England, where it's obviously heavily cereal. I think, and of course, food production is fundamental, and sometimes within this kind of environmental conversation, food is kind of left to the last point, which is of course madness, because we don't want to be importing our food. That's even worse what we're trying to achieve. So I think the food production conversation, I am definitely not best placed to talk about it per se, but I just think what we want and what we're trying to get to is a more systemic approach to the way that we use our land and resources. So we're doing projects with Anglian Water, who are trying to interface much more directly with the land managers to try and ensure that the day-to-day activities of those land managers, who obviously are just trying to produce great yields and produce great food, don't then have a knock-on detrimental impact in the river system that ends up incurring loads of costs for Anglian Water, and then means that the consumers have to pay more. So I think what we're trying to do here is we're trying to have like a systemic approach to the way that we consider using land, and make sure that the incentives are able to be shared in a cost-efficient way so that a market can form. Because the big arable producers in the east of England, who we all massively rely on, the question is, are there any opportunities for them to tweak their system that actually delivers them better outcomes, better yields, reduces the negative costs further downstream for other players, increases biodiversity, and helps us hit some of those bigger targets? I personally think it is all possible if we use this kind of systemic approach to understanding how do we get multiple parties to work closer together and make sure those market incentives and payment structures are there and easily accessible by the land managers. So all of a sudden, it's not a pain to do an agroforestry system. It's not a pain to do a water buffer strip that's going to cost you loads of money. It's simple, it's easy, it's cost efficient, it's got multiple benefits. So I think the food production system has got to be interwoven into this environmental conversation we're having, and making sure carbon is sequestered as a byproduct of its, the output. But we just take away all of that arduous burdensome administration that is basically the blocker to lots of people moving towards best practice. So yeah, I would just say it's kind of all part of the same picture. Yeah,
exactly. And on funding's always a really interesting one, because one of the big problems in the environmental world that I often see is, one, there's never enough money, which is a problem for everyone. But the cost of doing things really is astronomical. I mean, we're working on a big project at the moment. It's part of Stratford-upon-Avon. We're sort of looking at bits of the river to regenerate, creating new wetlands, and it's phenomenally expensive. And actually, when you think about the money just in monetary terms, you think, God, that's so much money. But actually, to do anything, it's not that much. And when you start looking at 70% of the UK, you really need an awful lot of funding to kind of go that far. And there's lots of people willing to fund, but they're often willing to fund very specific things. And I think that's one of the real stumbling blocks. And one of the stumbling blocks I often see and hear about is kind of the Forestry Commission. They're doing a lot of great work, but at the same time, they're very limited in that they'll fund forests. And we don't need forests. We need less dense systems to try and work with these agricultural systems. We have to look at more agroforestry, canopy cover objectives, and that type of thing. In my opinion, could be wrong, but that's my opinion on it. To be able to actually deliver these objectives, because we can't forest everything. And we have to look at tree cover, not forest cover. And if you look at the research coming from Ted Green and Jill Butler, who we had on, it's really interesting, and a lot of what Guy did NEP, that's basically that. It's not forest, it's trees here and there, hedgerows being overgrown, and all of this type of thing, which cumulatively have a massive impact, but still allow the land to be used in a productive way, but make it more efficient.
And this is a massive point. So I was with a group of farmers yesterday. So we're doing a 4,500 acre landscape scale project. It's about 22 landowners who have come together, and using the Land app have basically created a baseline across holding by holding. So what have we got exactly? How does it look, and how's it structured? And then they've all designed a future scenario. So where we want to put hedges, where we want to put infield trees, where we want to do natural regeneration. There's kind of connectivity woodland blocks as well, just to kind of create that landscape connectivity. So they've all done that holding by holding. And within the Land app, we can aggregate that into a landscape view. So we've done that, and you can see, therefore, the baseline across the 4,500 acres, so much more granular than Ordnance Survey data, more granular than RPA data. And then on top of that is the future vision that they all have. And the beauty of it is that where a land manager said, I wanted to put a hedge here, and their neighbour says, I want to put a hedge here, in this system, they can go, actually, if I nudge my hedge up 10 metres and you bring yours down 10 metres, we can create this connectivity. So this is kind of what the information transfer between multiple parties is enabling. So we can get these aligned designs. And what's exciting about that is we're working with a corporate that's based in just sort of 20 minutes away from the site. It's an international organisation who are very heavily committed to delivering great outcomes for nature. And it's looking like they're about to fund 4 kilometres of new hedges and potentially, I think it's 10 wetland restoration projects within this landscape. So anyway, point of all that is to say that what you fundamentally need, so big corporates also don't want to just fund a farm. They don't want a one-to-one relationship. They want to enhance the whole landscape, right? That's how the benefits are going to be derived. But you want to keep the admin as low as possible for everyone. So baseline, very easy to do on the Land app. Future design, very easy to do on the Land app. All in the UK HAB format. So we're working with Bill Butcher, who set up UK HAB, which is used to underpin the biodiversity 3.0 metric and biodiversity net gain. So everything's in the same consistent language. You can calculate the uplift in biodiversity units and then present that very cleanly to the corporates. And they go, off that palette of options, I want to fund the hedges and the wetland projects. Because it's already digital, it can be accounted for. A price per metre, which is what we've done for hedges, has been listed. And essentially, we're going through the kind of closing stages of that deal right now. So, and just to kind of try and explain how quickly this has happened, I went for a walk with the landowner, the key landowner within that landscape, about 12 weeks ago. And we're already at the stage of having a potential deal with a big corporate. And it's exciting because we've got the Surrey County Council involved in it, we've got the Surrey Wildlife Trust involved in it, we've got the facilitation funds involved in it, Natural England involved in it. It's all dovetailing into the new agri-environment scheme, or new ELMS, the government scheme. So what we're seeing is, to make these projects viable, efficient, scalable, the more that you can reduce that information flow between all those fundamentally relevant stakeholders, the quicker you can get to a point of transaction with a full audit trail. So kind of, I guess I'm looking through potentially a bit of a blinkered lens, but everything we're doing is trying to enable great outcomes, and we're just trying to make the process as efficient as possible, and that's the model we're using at the moment.
Yeah, no, it makes absolute sense. And it's, as you say, it's all about streamlining, because so much time is lost in the sort of bureaucratic world, really.
Yep.
So how are you seeing sort of the new government objectives tying with this? So obviously ELMS is coming up.
Yep.
And I was wondering if you could maybe explain a bit about that, because you've got it better than I do.
Yeah.
And kind of how it's going, and if things are looking positive or
definitely.
Or not.
Yeah, I think it is looking positive. I think there's lots to do, but it's a new scheme. It's the first time it's really ever happened.
It's very exciting.
It's hugely exciting, and I think DEFRA and Janet Hughes are just doing an amazing job to really. I mean, I would not want to be in their shoes. Like the complexity, the amount of stakeholders you've got to keep happy, the fact that you're still answering to Treasury, the fact we've just had COVID, we're in COVID, whatever. It's not an easy position. But so Janet Hughes is doing an amazing job, and I met up with her about 6 weeks ago at the Hopkin estate just out in Norfolk, and essentially ELMS. Environmental Land Management Scheme is the new way that farmers or land managers are going to get paid to deliver public benefits. So previously we were in the Common Agricultural Policy, a load of cash came to the UK, distributed, and that was the basic payment scheme that paid farmers. And you just got paid on an acreage basis. You didn't have to do anything particularly, you just had to not be negligent. Whereas this new fund is all about delivering public benefits. So it's public money for public goods. And what that's causing is for land managers for the first time to have to be very strategic with what they do where. So, oh my gosh, as a farm, we're only going to get paid to deliver public benefits. Okay, well, what is our asset base? What could we enhance? Who's going to tell us where we should do certain things? So it's causing every land manager to start to have to think very strategically about what they offer to this new market, and therefore what's their future income stream going to come from that. And then so ELMS as a philosophy, that's kind of how it works, and there's more detail obviously, but what's exciting, I think, is that the way that DEFRA are configuring it is that it's a scheme structured to enable corporates to also invest into that landscape. So it's not just public money that's going to create the environmental uplift, it's going to be an enabler, it's going to be a fund that's an enabler for corporates to invest as well. And that brings a world of different challenges in. What's the data language that's being used so everyone knows? What's the audit trail? What's the reporting structure? How do you notify land managers of the multiple opportunities? How do you make sure they're not double funded, triple funded, quadruple funded? And again, probably slightly blinkered view, but you fundamentally need a simple audit trail that allows a land manager to essentially say, this is what I'm willing to contribute into the market, for the models to estimate the benefits that are going to be derived, obviously the payment rates, and then essentially maybe 70% of that new buffer strip or wildflower meadow or woodland block or hedge, maybe 70% is funded by, government, and 30% by EasyJet, or 30% by, the water company. And so there's quite a challenge inside that model to make sure that the audit trail is simple, that the contract structure is understandable for the land manager, and that the administration is low, so that once that agreement is, signed, that the verification is able to be accessed by the funding parties. So, great, I've put in my new hedge or my new wildflower meadow or my new woodland block. DEFRA can be notified that I'm actually delivering against contract, and also EasyJet or whoever know that that contract is being fulfilled. The reason that that's important is DEFRA are going to be reporting to Treasury. This is public money that's being used, so we need a very clear reporting structure. And also the corporates are, maybe it's philanthropic money, but really, I guess what a corporate would want is to make sure that their investments are fairly recognised in their annual report, their shareholders get updated, their customers get updated, because at the moment as a new market, it's still a investment for a competitive advantage, predominantly. So ELMS is it's an amazing opportunity. It's opening up this new market for corporates to invest into. It's got a world of complexity that will make it, that it needs to get through to make it possible. And I guess where we sit as the Land app is to try to make that process as simple and easy for all parties because if the admin cost is high, the corporates aren't going to invest. If the admin costs are high, the public are going to be, very frustrated that a lot of this precious public money is getting wasted in bureaucratic systems. And I think we're in quite a good position because in the Land app we have about 40% of farmland in England has now been mapped onto the platform by our customers. Oh, wow. And that's actually only the farms that have put their field boundaries in. So there's a lot more that's just rural estates. But anyway, the point is, what we want to do with that kind of customer base is to make sure as many people can kind of get into this new scheme, because we need a market as quickly as possible for ELMS to work, for the natural capital market to work, for essentially nature to enhance. So ELMS is an amazing opportunity to bring this whole thing together. There's just a lot of complexity we need to work through as a system until it's a fully functioning marketplace that can really allow nature to thrive and can be replicated internationally as well.
Well, that's it. I mean, there's going to be so many companies that look to invest in this because it's reliable.
Yeah.
A lot of corporations and various organisations I've met that fund, I won't name any names, but fund various organisations are often becoming sort of increasingly worried that they're not necessarily knowing where their money's going and what it's going to. And whilst they might be giving to a charity or something else, you still don't necessarily always know what it is. And also it's something you can see. That's one of the really fantastic things about land management. You can see the trees that have been planted, you can see the wetland, you can hear the birds, it's something that's tangible. And the whole way we're looking at using land is changing. It's not just about ecology and biodiversity and carbon. If COVID's taught us anything, it's about we need to spend more time outdoors. And people have really realised the value of that. So it's also about how do we connect up the outdoors and these rural estates and rural bits of land to cities, to people, to increase. And also farms have got to diversify as well. This is an increasing area of their income. A lot of farms generate more of their income through diversification means, holiday lets and events, paintballing, all this type of thing. So there's a huge market for those type of things too to help support farms. So it's all about finding, again, it's not going to be funded the same way, but farms are having to rethink how they manage their systems and how they try and get people more involved. And it's also pushing sort of down that line, isn't it? How do people use these spaces?
It's huge. And actually the corporate that we're working with, and I wish I could name them because they're so wonderful and they've been so great in the process, but one of their primary wants out of this investment that they're going to make is that actually their employees can be really engaged in the process. They can survey the hedges, they can be part of planting it, that camaraderie that forms, the mental health benefits, the physical health benefits. And I think that public engagement and that kind of connection to nature is really what we need as a society, because there's so much eco-anxiety that people are incredibly aware of, but at the moment don't have any kind of ways of dealing with. And I think these projects are a perfect platform for that kind of reconnection to nature, or that ability to actually give something back, with their time and resources. So that's one thing. The other thing, actually, I'm a very good friend of mine who I was actually with in Wales over the weekend. He runs a company called Impact Marathon Series, and what they do is they basically set up projects in different parts of the world with a specific focus. So in cities, it's much more about social well-being and welfare and whatnot. But they're doing a project in the Isle of Mull, and they're doing a big reforestation project. So what happens is loads of people from different parts of the world or country come to that site. They spend a week doing voluntary work, and then it finishes with either a marathon, a half marathon, a 10K, or a big walk. And it's an amazing model to bring people into nature, engage as a community, feel part of something bigger. And it's a model we're looking to bring to this project in Surrey. We've got this 4,500 acres, this huge environmental enhancement project, lots of stakeholders. Can we now get, the employees of this corporate, the local people, the friends and family to come and actually properly participate in the landscape? And I think that's critical, because we know, we always will invest in what we care about, and the more people can really learn to care about nature and the positive impacts it has, the more investment there's going to be. So
definitely. I mean, we were talking yesterday on the podcast with Sophie Beasley, who we've got an episode with that you'll be able to see, and she used to run a youth program for the Wildlife Trust that I was part of, and it kind of turned my life around and got me from being a naughty kid back into education and all that type of thing. And this was exactly what we basically did, but it was on the Wildlife Trust estate.
Yep.
So actually, if it means more schools and more community groups and more disadvantaged kids and more troubled kids can kind of get out into the wild, get their hands on, get a bit of responsibility, that has a huge value. And again, the episode we talked to Merrick about, we talked about the Learning Through Landscapes trust that he set up with David Attenborough. And that's all about getting kids learning outdoors. And 80% of the curriculum can be taught outdoors, and they've got all the resources to do that. So actually, it's about, there's a huge opportunity for schools to connect with these places too.
Yeah.
And, that's another whole different side to it. That'll probably come much later.
Yeah.
But, there is this opportunity to sort of tie so many issues together to really create something that benefits everybody.
Yeah.
And I'm mostly involved in the urban realm at the moment, but, my background's forestry, and you can see so much starting to change. And we, another episode we did to try and get everyone to listen to all of our episodes, of course. We did one with Dougal Driver, and he's from Grown in Britain, and he was talking about, the range of opportunities for timber and its uses for the future. Used for LCD screens of computers, satellites, cars. If you think about it, trees are made from the same stuff that oil's made from, essentially. So if you can break them down, we can replace a lot of plastics. But we need more trees. And it doesn't matter where those trees come from if you're breaking them down. So we don't need necessarily as many traditional kind of forestry systems. We can go for these sparser, scraggly, horrible trees and still make use of the timber and all this type of thing. So there's such a huge opportunity to rethink sort of the environmental economy and put some of these things in place to really tie the whole thing together. And that's going to be vital, and knowing where those things can come from. Again, that's something much later that can kind of, which we've talked about before, which can kind of be looked at of where some of these resources might come from and finding out what's available and starting to plan that longer landscape scale management into a lot of these things.
Yeah, I definitely, trees as an example. So this landscape specifically that I keep referring to, there's a lot of undermanaged woodland, and actually, they don't know how to make money from it. And yesterday I was talking to one of the landowners, and he was saying, we had to sell a bunch of trees because we needed to thin them, but we got such a low price, we hardly made anything on it. And it's just, fundamentally the problem is a lack of coordination. I mean, really that's what it comes down to. And I think, what we really hope is that if, for example, someone was running a project where within a specific landscape they wanted to have certain management practices implemented, or they wanted to buy trees or whatever, what we hope is that they could literally just draw on that shape onto a map. All the landowners would get notified of that opportunity, and hey presto, they can engage in it. And I think what we want is more of this kind of landscape scale joined up thinking that allow these market opportunities to become real, because it's pain if there's 10 hectares there, 10 hectares 100 miles away, 10 hectares. We want to try and create these more sustainable local economies, and I think the only way to do that is by working in this kind of collaborative nature across landscapes, making sure that opportunities are really clear for people, and that ability to interface with those opportunities and funding sources are really, really accessible. And I think once that's possible, there'll be these amazing marketplaces, and it'll be so simple. And we're just going through that kind of transition phase now between everything being arduous and impossible to see through to, I think, where it'll be super transparent, super clear, and these trades are going to happen really efficiently. And I think that's why I think, once we get the systems in place, it's going to be simple to transition to something far more sustainable.
Indeed, but there's so much application for it internationally as well, which is something we were talking about when we first met. Because a lot of what you're doing is, well, as everything is now, is sort of geolocated, which means there's a huge opportunity for funding to places, anywhere in the world, really. Because you have that ability to see, if you're funding someone to plant trees or regenerate part of their farm, be it in Asia, Africa, wherever it may be, you can see that it's actually been done. And this is a conversation that I've been involved with a few times lately, where people are sort of going, well, we've invested a lot in charity in the past, but we're still, we've been investing for so long in some of these places, and we're not really seeing. But you can't see because it's so far away and not necessarily able to get there. It's actually, you can create a direct link between the people on the ground and these funding sources to be able to implement a lot of these things. And once we have that in place here in the UK, it's a fantastic model for anywhere else in the world. So there's, it's so important, and something that people don't really always realise, that the value of this is amazing. 70% of the UK is farmland. So that's all going to be impacted by this. And forestry most likely will be as well, especially as the way things are changing. So, that's 85% of the UK's land area. which is enormous.
Yeah.
So it's incredible. And when you start factoring that to many other countries, it really shows such huge promise.
Yeah, it's so exciting. And I think obviously we're trying to do what we're doing in the UK to kind of catalyse this new market and kind of just enable space for all these players to actually engage. But it's great to solve a problem in the UK. Of course it is. We've got a lot of objectives we need to hit, and we want to be leading, the world in this kind of stuff. But for us to kind of do anything to even slightly impact on climate change or biodiversity loss, or it has the most important thing is the model, because if we can get blended finance where public and private sector can both invest effectively into landscape enhancement, the land managers responsible for each of those blocks of land scattered throughout the world can be notified of those opportunities. The sort of top-down approach where priorities can be highlighted to work out where the best point of intervention is to start. I really think, because most of the corporates that really have an obligation to invest in nature are international, and they have a real international remit. Obviously, every government, has a huge obligation to deliver some of these goals. And I think that because nature does such an amazing job of restoring itself, if its foundations are set properly, actually with very minimal relative cash, we can create massive global economic enhancement.
Yeah.
The reason, I personally think that a huge reason why there's a lot of social issues is fundamentally because resources are not available. There's not enough water, there's not enough food, there's not enough building materials. There's far more likelihood of corruption or whether it's war or just conflict. And actually, if you have a thriving natural environment that produces the materials that people essentially need, it gives a foundation for people.
Pressure,
it's one less, exactly.
And then big pressure.
Yeah, then
the most fundamental pressure, basically.
Exactly.
Survivability.
Otherwise, you're always, if Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right, and you're constantly scraping at the bottom, education isn't going to be the thing you're focused on. Contribution is not going to be the thing you focus on.
Yeah.
Innovation is not going to be. And so fundamentally, what we need to do, I believe, is that we need to make sure that we've got the natural environment working properly. We're restoring degraded ecosystems, regreening, whether it's regreening deserts as far as that, but restoring ecosystems for sure. That will give a foundation for people to start to advance what they're able to do, be educated, connecting with innovation and technology, be able to get educated wherever they are in the world, be part of this global conversation. And I think that will then lead to a much more thriving economy. I think if you undermine, the way to undermine an economy is you take away the natural environment. Whereas if you can put those building blocks in place, you can cause economies to thrive, I think. So that's why I think the model is so important, that we work out how to get governments and corporates to invest effectively into the best points of intervention within a landscape. We enable that to be very easily understood and accessed by the land managers, designed, delivered, verified. The funding happens effectively. And if we can do that en masse, that will give society what it needs to thrive, but it'll be the only way we mitigate climate change. Because otherwise we've got our economic system unfortunately incentivizes exploitation. Really, it's easier to cut down a tree and get paid the amount than keep it there and it essentially not. So we need to reverse that model. And if we do en masse, I don't see why we wouldn't be able to have a massive positive impact in mitigating climate change in a very short space of time. But fundamentally, it all comes down to that model of how the investment works. And that fundamentally comes down to information exchange. Because we're talking about land, it's geospatial. And essentially, that's the core remit of the Land app. If we're not doing that, there's no point us being in existence. So, that's kind of how I sort of see things playing out into the future. And there's a lot of cash and investment to come into this world. And I just think that if ever there was one place to intervene within the whole market, it's getting that model right. Because then everyone can then deploy their resources effectively, and we can all get where we need to be.
Exactly. And I think just to touch on the international side again, it's why the landscape character side of things is so important, because there's such a discussion around kind of colonialism and people from the West coming in and imposing systems and programs and all this stuff, models on other nations. The landscape character side is really vital, because it's all rooted in local geology, local ecology and local distinctiveness. So it's all about restoring systems wherever they are. It's not coming and going, woodland's best. It's about looking at what is actually there and how do we protect and maintain what is or was there. And it's all about that. So it all comes down to sort of local people, communities, if we can get this community side of things sorted too.
Yep.
So, you know, all of that is vital.
Yep.
And that's why it has such, the base of that has such promise globally to fix so many things.
Yep.
And many countries don't even have those sort of things in place yet. So it's a great example to show how this broader approach to everything applies, because, you know, check out the episode with Merrick if you haven't, anyone listening as well, because he helped found the first landscape character area here in Hampshire, actually, where we are now, where we're on Hampshire-Surrey border. So this side of the gate, we're in Hampshire. This side of the gate, we're in Surrey. So, you know, interesting part of the world. And what they've done is fascinating, because it supports the urban side of things too. Because if you think about it traditionally, a lot of the historic buildings we would have been made from local resources. You know, Cotswolds, it's all Cotswold stone. You know, up in Sheffield, it's all the stone from there. And you see this local distinctiveness and this local character. So it goes far beyond even just this, you know, the ecology side of things. There's so many facets to it that are really, really important. And that's all about what we need to look at now for the future. Is how we restore these things, how we create local distinctiveness, restore ecosystems in their locality, and what should be where, and make the landscape how it wants to be, but in a way that also works with us. Yeah,
definitely. I think if you play out visions, you know, if we keep the way that we're tending to do stuff at the moment, where exploitation is easier for short-term economic gain, it's kind of easy to see where that road leads to. And I don't think anyone would particularly want to live in that potential future. And the thing is, I just don't think it's necessary. And I think the alternative future is one where there is abundance, there is ecological abundance, there's biodiversity abundance, there's ideally societal and cultural and economic abundance. You know, that's really, and I often think kind of the way I guess I slightly think about stuff is, you know, somewhat what are the guiding principles that are going to, you know, I'm going to use to decide what I do, because all of us in any moment could do whatever we want. Like we're not fixed on anything. Sure, we might have some commitments, but so I kind of think, well, if you can shoot for any star, why wouldn't you shoot for one where everything kind of works in harmony, everyone has what they need, people thrive, nature thrives. And I sometimes get myself a bit locked on this idea of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Like, what foundations do we all need so we can more effectively transition to us kind of being more sort of...
Well, do you want to explain the hierarchy of needs a little bit for anyone that might not know what it is?
Yeah, definitely, in my very layman's terms. But essentially, I guess the core foundation is if you don't have food, water, air, shelter, if you don't have that, you're going to really struggle. You're going to really, really struggle if you don't have air. So basically, it sort of starts with that foundation that, you know, what are the basic needs of a human? Okay, once those things are in place, cool. And then I can't remember the exact, you know, levels that it moves up, but then it kind of moves more into, okay, once you've got that, then you've got relationships, you've got friendships, you've got kind of culture, education. Okay, cool. Once you've got those sort of things, then you can have productivity, you can have trade, you can have kind of this this kind of next level that you can move to, and it kind of moves essentially up into, you know, self-transcendence, this kind of spiritual level that you can get to once you've kind of got all of the layers covered. And so the reason I think that's a useful framework, and I've probably not explained it very well, but is that, you know, the more that we undermine the core foundations of what it is to be a human, kind of able to really live a fulfilled life, you know, I don't understand why we would do that. You know, we're currently under, you know, that process of doing that.
Well, everything else becomes desperate and secondary.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You know, friendships become secondary, education becomes secondary. It's kind of, you move into survival mode. And I think we're obviously as a species trying to move out of that. That's constantly how we're wired. So I guess, so I think fundamentally it's kind of like, where's this, you know, where are we aiming for? It's kind of, you know, at least I know it might be a romantic ideal to aim towards abundance, but it's a possibility, and why wouldn't we? And therefore, with that in mind, what can we put in place that allows that to become possible? And I think, ecological foundations, then you've got societal, then you've got economic, and you've got whatever you've got on top of that. But I guess, so I see a trajectory where everything can go in one direction, which is exploitative, potentially you could use the word corruption, but certainly detrimental, or you could go towards abundance. And so why wouldn't we try and get everyone on that kind of train essentially, and it won't be perfect, but at least if we've got that aim, we're going to go better than if we just leave everything as status quo.
It's better to aim high and fall short than not try, basically.
Yeah.
Isn't it?
So I guess that's kind of, again, how we try and collaboratively work with everyone to move as one, rather than work in a competitive way that sort of undermines that principle.
Yeah, no, it's such an important guiding, principle and set of values, isn't it?
Yeah.
Because that's what drives us all.
Yeah.
And that's I think why me and you clicked early on, because we've kind of got these principles and we know where we want to go and we know what needs to be done, and it's just a case of dragging everything along with us as we kind of go, isn't it?
Yeah.
Which is what we're both trying to do in our own way, in our own kind of areas. And it's fantastic that we met each other when we did, because so much is happening now that we're able to kind of influence and collaborate on.
Yeah.
It's fantastic. Stars aligned in a way. Fate, who knows? But it's really interesting. It's really interesting. And I wanted to ask, how did you get into all of this kind of in the first place? Because everyone we've spoken to quite often has quite an obscure way of getting into kind of the environmental world, and it's not always the way people might think. So how did you get involved?
Well, I was brought up on a farm, so that was amazing. Lambs
That's
jumping.
A key link.
Yeah. So lambs jumping on hay bales and everything like that. And so that was obviously lovely and very sweet. But what happened specifically, actually, I think, is that as I was kind of growing up and, 16, 17, I was having conversations with my granddad, who had farmed the farm his entire life. And he was essentially saying that he could see the demise of small and medium-sized farms. Essentially the way things were rigged up, the commodity market, the food supply chain, the bigger powers within the land sector, it was essentially, he could see the demise of essentially that world. And from my perspective, I didn't really want the farm to be sold, so I was thinking, God, shit, this does not look like the direction that I want to go in. And I guess that kind of struck a question in my mind, like, how could we reverse this? And what happened specifically? Then I was lucky enough to travel around the world, and I realised, oh my gosh, that the problem that we're facing on our farm is not unique to us. Mm-hmm. It's not looking great in a lot of different places, and that was doing, a 4-day wilderness trail. It was working in farms in Australia, in France, and I realised, oh my God, we really need to do something here, because this is not a nice to have problem to solve. This is if we don't solve this, this is not good. So that was kind of like, I guess, the catalyzer for me to choose that this was the path to go down. And then I came back from travels and I studied permaculture, which is basically land system designed, which is very much about how do you use design principles and design thinking to align to natural systems. So you're not always fighting nature, you're aligning to it, and actually the output is, better as a result, and long-term resilience. And then luckily, within 2 weeks, there was a regenerative agriculture course. So I went and did that, and this was 12 years ago. And that was kind of using those system design principles, but within a broader landscape, within the farmed environment. And I was like, fantastic, this looks brilliant. This is exactly what I've been looking for. Let's try and apply this thinking to the farm. And it was then that it was kind of like paper maps, Google Earth, whatever. And so that was kind of where the whole idea of the Land app came from. But really, I think it was the recognition of, if we don't do something, this is not good. Something needs to be done. Okay, what could be done? And that just kind of sparks a bunch of ideas. And for whatever reason, I was then pig-headed enough to keep pursuing it. But the transition I also slightly recognized, whenever this was, 12 years ago, whatever, that there's a massive thing that needs to be done for things to work. And I feared that if I was to try and do a sort of farm consultancy, farm by farm, I recognised within my lifetime I probably wasn't going to really move the needle. And so that was why I was like, okay, well, technology is a thing, that seems smart. So then I kind of thought, okay, well, fine, I'll think about technology. And that's when I started weaving these ideas together, speaking to loads of people. And I was fortunate enough actually then to end up being in Ordnance Survey's innovation program. So weirdly, I went down to Ordnance Survey. I said, I've got this idea for a piece of mapping software. You've got to help me. And in the first meeting, they said, I don't know how we're going to do that. Sorry, Tim. I went back 6 weeks later and I said, no, guys, you really do need to help me. And it just so happened it was just then that they had launched the Ordnance Survey Innovation Hub, Geovation, in London. So they said, look, just call this guy. Don't really know what he's doing, but it's some innovation thing. Go and chat.
Yeah.
So I called them up, went straight up to London and walked into this massive empty room with two guys sat on chairs and a coffee machine. And that was the Ordnance Survey's sort of Geovation. And so I was like, guys, here's my idea. You know, it was the innovation lead, the head techie. And great, we started building this plan. And that was why I was, oh my God, this thing is possible. And then they said, hey, well, Tim, actually, we're starting an innovation program, a 6-month innovation program in 2 months' time. Apply. And, you know, if you get in, then great. So I did that. I was accepted. It started on my birthday, one of those weird things. And 6 months, met loads of people within DEFRA, within Land Registry, within Ordnance Survey, and had a proof of concept. And that was enough to go out to farmers and estate owners and land agents and say, guys, would this make sense? And that was enough validation to raise the first round of investment. So it's kind of been this very organic journey from like an original recognition of, you know, what the problem was and maybe how I could contribute, doing all this thinking, ending up with a few things like falling into place. And, you know, yeah, a few years later, you know, we've got 40% of farmland in England, and we're working with corporates and governments to make sure the investments into landscapes are really effective. So we're, in my head, although this is probably going to be the same until the day I die, we're still very much day one of the plan. You know, this is phase one. And because I just think there's so much to do. But anyway, so that's been
there is so much to do.
There's so much to do. So that's been the journey to date. So from the farm to the conversation with my granddad, the recognition of the problem, the idea of, okay, technology, the fortuitous set of events that came together until, we're sat here having this conversation.
That's it. Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, similar, you know, there's so many, as you say, there's so much to do, you know, and my view was not enough people are hearing about the fantastic stuff. Well, it was actually our original conversation that sparked the whole kind of podcast idea. Yeah. So, you know, one of our pub conversations.
Yes, it was.
You know, so, you know, and here we are. So it's really interesting how these things sort of get going and take off and move forward, isn't it?
Yeah.
And I mean, there's just so much happening in so many different areas. I also wanted to ask you a little bit about, because we've talked a lot about the future of cities as well, kind of over a beer. So we don't have to necessarily air all of it.
That might be a big conversation, yeah.
But I'd be interested to get your thoughts on kind of the future of food production in like the hydroponic side of things.
Oh God.
Because obviously there's a massive, agriculture is going through a really interesting period. Obviously it's facing this huge regeneration. There's huge opportunities now with offices and warehouses being abandoned or not used in cities to produce food where it is needed. And that has a huge opportunity to take large areas of land out of management. So if you take a large supermarket, a single supermarket sort of sized farm as it could be, as it would be, can replace 700 acres of farmland. So there's a hugely interesting kind of thing coming up there around all of that, but it's not applicable to everything. So it's not applicable to a lot of kind of arable products, like the core staples. It's not necessarily applicable to at the moment. It's more like lettuces and fruits and things like that. I know. So it's not a solution to all of agriculture's troubles.
I know.
But there is a very interesting opportunity there. So is this something you've kind of pondered, and a lot of people bringing this up, or?
No, not many people are bringing it up. I don't know whether I should share my full thoughts, but I might end up doing that. How shall I start? I totally agree that this is a fundamental question to open up, and this may be slightly why I talk about Land App being kind of phase one of the journey, because, like I say, fundamentally what we need as a foundation for society is strong ecological roots. If we don't have that, you know, if we deplete all the rivers, we pollute all the rivers, we destroy all the ecosystems, we cause desertification, climate change gets out of control, not much point, you know, being here. So fundamentally we need that root set, and then we can kind of create that, you know, societal expansion and self-transcendence, whatever we want to call it, but basically having a much better time. And then, but so in that, you have the next question, population growth. Obviously, cities tend to just expand, consume. One concern that I have, although this is a bit more philosophical, is I fear how much of people's income ends up going back into either rent or mortgages or whatever. It's just and that I mean, again, it's probably a bit. But what I'm concerned about is that keeps people on a rat race.
Yeah.
and people do not do what they know in their heart they want to do. And you speak to so many people, and they're like,
no security.
No security. I would love to live my life doing this. I'd love to spend more time with my kids. I really would love to get, but I can't because I have to pay my mortgage. I have to pay my rent, and so that's an issue. Secondarily, at the moment, I still think the kind of unit cost per person is really, really scary. Like the amount of carbon that each person consumes, whether that's just living in a house and heating and lighting and everything else, but also the food they consume, and just the amount of cost that every human incurs for carbon and for energy is just ridiculous, and we cannot carry on like that if we're going to do whatever we want to do on this planet while we're here. So what I think is going to be the most powerful thing, and this may not even be in our lifetimes, maybe it will, hopefully it will, I personally think architecture is going to be the next massive transition in the way that humanity occupies the planet. And so what I think, although I don't think I've ever talked to anyone about this particularly, is I think, so for example, you look at things like what Foster and Partners are doing. You know, there's just and Norman Foster was, a student of Buckminster Fuller. Buckminster Fuller came up with the geodesic dome, the concept of the trim tab, this idea of doing more with less. And I just think that Foster and Partners, some of the projects they've worked on, kind of the Mexico City airport that they were looking to do and things like that, it shows how really, really smart design thinking can be applied to architecture in such a way that you could massively support human life, human well-being. The point you make about aquaponics and food production, keeping that very much closer in proximity to where humans are living. If the buildings were built at the scale they may need to be, which may have to occupy lots and lots of people, you would cut the energy cost per person, you cut carbon cost per person, you cut the food impact cost per person, you'd cut the actual cost to live within that residence would be massively reduced because you get the economies of scale of the size of infrastructure. You would massively reduce the land impact of people's consumption needs and requirements. You'd cut down the need for roads and public transport because everyone would be contained within a place that they're really able to thrive. So I kind of feel like if humanity is going to be able to continue to thrive, we need to create more wilderness areas. We need more conservation areas. We need more biodiversity.
Hive cities is what we need.
But I think inside that model, and I can't quite visualize this because I've never been into it, but I suspect if it was done properly, there's enough light, air, plants, people, society, there was less cost per week for living. That would be an amazing potential place for people to be. And I think people naturally get a lot of satisfaction from solving problems. I think we all love to solve problems, and I don't think there's any shortage of problems. They will just be more transcendent problems to solve. We are all doing more with less right now. We don't have to go out and kill every animal we eat, right? We don't,
Indeed.
Humanity is trying to move to a point where we do more with less, and actually we're able to kind of be more our full selves. It's kind of, I think, our underlying drive as a species. And I think this kind of environment would really allow us to fully be who we're meant to be and wanting to be. So I think we need to create more space for nature. We need to reduce the impact of people on the planet. We need to make people able to do what they care about in a way that's really cost efficient, helps them fulfill what they're up to. And I think architecture is going to be a huge component of that. So yeah, but I don't think I've ever told anyone that. So anyway, here we go.
Well, we need a pint.
Yeah, another pint.
Pint,
100%.
But I agree. I think I'm a bit of a hypocrite because I'm looking at building a house at the moment. Yeah. But I don't think houses are necessarily the future. Because they can't be. We can't keep sprawling to the extent we are. Yeah. We need to be smarter with resources. Yeah. And smarter in terms of time and everything else. And if we're able to create systems that are incredibly resilient, that's what we've got to do. Yeah. And if we need to cut down using materials, that's what we've got to do. Yeah. So we've got to start thinking, and the government actually touched on something a while ago where they were saying, the UK's got the lowest houses in Europe. A lot of, you get more of these kind of small blocks of flats like you see in Paris and parts of London and other places too. But largely we're not really doing that. And actually we need to start thinking about how we make it denser. Yeah. But not in the kind of the Soviet style.
Yes, correct.
Definitely not that way, but more, but then there are some principles from that are actually really interesting. My wife's from Belarus, so I've spent a bit of time there, and there's a really, really strong community feel between a lot of these spaces because they're all connected by green space. The buildings, really need a good look at, but if you can solve that side and use a lot of the new technologies we have with green roofs, producing food where it is, there's such an opportunity to kind of get people engaged, get people living in a healthier environment. You remove the need for cars. We don't need a lot of these things that we currently have now if you're able to do that.
Correct.
Most people I know now work from home. Not everyone. I know a lot of engineers and builders and stuff who don't, but actually, my business is we're all based at home. And more people are. So actually, we can rethink what we kind of need. And if there's more facilities, more recreation opportunities, and a better access to resources, better health, better quality of life, all of those things, that's really something, as you say, we've got to strive for and to get to. But it comes down to very difficult, challenging decisions of how do we fundamentally change the way we design cities. And that's something I'm slightly involved with, I suppose, but not at a city level. We're still doing things plot by plot here, but you were starting to see it happen because of things like the green belt, and that's why another reason why the green belt is so important is because it has to drive that innovation in use within cities. But the green belt itself has to be used much better, which is where Land App comes in to make that more accessible and better designed and giving benefits back to people. So there's a real paradigm shift taking place at the moment, and people know all these things. You can talk to anyone at any level, they kind of go, well, things have got to change. But taking that leap is very, very challenging. It's difficult. It's not the norm. But actually we've got to start, thinking about these things and thinking, okay, right, what's the 100-year plan? Definitely. Which some cities do. Singapore does it, 100-year plan. Parts of Singapore city are owned on a 100-year lease. So when that 100 years comes up, they've had that time to build new accommodation that's better, that meets the challenges of that part of the city, and then they move all of those people, because they're on a lease, into that area. And it has to be better than what they're currently in. Now, a lot of countries say that and don't do it, so obviously it's an aspiration, but that means a city can adapt and change and respond to the various challenges it's facing at the time. And that's what we've got to start looking at in the West, because it's too, we're going too far the wrong way, unfortunately, I think.
I agree. I think that long-term view is fundamental. You can't make, I don't think, informed decisions that have clout when looking at a short-term time horizon, because you just don't give yourself the time to invest and actually, derive the benefits of the investment and then grow from there. So I'm very fortunate. My uncle spent a lot of time living in the Amazon and, lots of interesting stuff like that. And anyway, and he has taught kids for his whole life, and he very much brought in kind of the Native American wisdom kind of as part of the education process to help people kind of build wisdom as well as just the pure education. And a huge component which he always used to talk to me about is this idea of Native Americans used to use this 7 generations thinking. They would process a lot of the decisions through that lens of, what impact would this have on 7 generations? And I think that's really, really important because, and I think that's, somewhat what's caused me to maybe think slightly whatever the way I think, but it's fundamentally, at a foundational level, what do we need as a species? What are we trying to do? Where are we trying to get to? Okay, cool. And then I think that's just kind of helped, me paint the pictures of, okay, cool, well, how can we get models that work, that are internationally scalable? What would that lead to? Or naturally it would lead to probably more people, living in the way that we just explained. And where might that end up leading people? And then the big question is, what are we trying to get to anyway? What is this all about? And I think that multi-generational perspective, I think, helps address and answer some of the bigger questions that we have, and I think creates an alignment which is very hard to do when you're just looking at short-term time horizon problem solving.
Exactly. I mean, I think forestry gave me that perspective, because obviously when you plant a tree, you're not planting it for yourself. You plant, if it's oak or something, you're planting it for 2 or 3 generations time. So we've always had to have that kind of long-term thinking in approach to basically every project we did at the time. And we're doing the same with landscape. How are people going to use this in the future? How's it going to change? How do we make it so it is adaptable going forward? And that's a real challenge, but it's a real opportunity is what it is, and a lot of these things are incredibly rewarding. They can give people a real sense of purpose, and they're great projects to get involved with at all different levels.
I totally agree. And I think it's just interesting to, sometimes reflect on what creates fulfillment. It often is about giving back. It often is about service. It often is about some kind of legacy that you can see resulting from the work that you're doing. And I don't know, I just think that's a nice way to approach life. Because I mean, work, the 9 to 5, whatever, it's essentially, I think it's trying to contribute something that allows more to happen, good return on investment for the time that's spent. And I think if we get more people doing that, thinking about that way, and I think the environmental social governance, reporting that needs to come into corporates and kind of that, the whole natural capital market and this idea of the circular economy, I think it all kind of creates these questions of how can we contribute to something more than ourselves, and that'd be a really powerful way of living and using time while we're here.
Definitely, no, I couldn't agree more. And that could be a really great point to end on. So thank you so much for joining us and telling us all the incredible things you're up to. It's fascinating.
Thank you, Niall. And I have to say, I think this is great. I think the more that these conversations come together, who knows, watching all of the episodes, like what new ideas might spark off the back of that and what networks can form. So yeah, thank you for having me. It's
certainly, you're very welcome. Hope to have you back soon and hear how it's developed.
Yeah, with pleasure. Yeah.
It's important to remember that sustainability doesn't just relate to the environment, it relates to your finances as well. That's why we switched to Beans Accountants. Beans operate on a package system, so you always know where you stand. We halved our accountancy costs when we moved to them, and one of our associates moved to them as well and reduced theirs by 2/3. With free tax advice, accountancy support, and everything else they offer, you can't go wrong. So make sure you check out Beans Accountants in the description below. I really hope you have enjoyed this episode. If you're interested in finding out more about farming, nature, and how the UK used to be, then check out our episode with Ted and Jill. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share to friends and colleagues who might be interested in the series. And a huge thank you to our sponsor, Beans Accountants, and our incredibly kind supporters, Gillian Goodson Design and the Birmingham Botanical Gardens. And of course, NDLA and Monster Don for powering this episode.